Miss Marple and the Tea-Chest with the False Bottom. Good evening and welcome back to Cafe Tales. I'm Ailey, your host, and I want to start by thanking you from the heart. Your support and presence here make this journey truly special. Preparing these mysteries is a labor of love, and it's so rewarding to see how many of you find comfort and delight in them. Our cozy community keeps growing, and that's thanks to you. If you'd like to help us share even more timeless stories, please remember to subscribe. Now, let's settle in and drift together into tonight's mystery. Chapter 1. Kettle and Vanish. The morning mist hung low over St. Mary Mead as March crept in with its usual blend of hope and hesitation. It was one of those early spring days when winter seemed reluctant to loosen its grip entirely, and the villagers moved about their business with the careful optimism of those who had learned not to trust the weather too quickly. Miss Jane Marple paused in her cottage garden, secateurs in hand, contemplating the brave shoots of daffodils that had pushed through the dark earth near her garden gate. The air carried that particular sharpness that spoke of change, though whether for better or worse remained to be seen. She had learned over her many years in the village that change often brought with it more than just the turning of seasons. "Good morning, Miss Marple," called Mrs. Pike from the lane, her milk jug clattering against the basket she carried. Nora Pike was a brisk woman of middle years, all efficiency and purpose, who had run the post office with military precision ever since her husband's passing 5 years previously. She lived in the flat above the post office and knew the weight and measure of every parcel, letter, and piece of gossip that passed through St. Mary Mead. "Good morning, Mrs. Pike," Miss Marple replied, straightening slowly. "You're abroad early this morning." "Indeed I am, making my rounds for the milk before opening the post office. Though I dare say I won't be the only one up with the larks today. Have you seen anything of Abel Toms this morning?" Miss Marple shook her head thoughtfully. Abel Toms was one of those quiet souls who seemed to drift through village life like a shadow, noticed more for his absence than his presence. He lived in a small cottage he had whimsically named the Kettle, on the lane that wound behind the high street, and made his living as a herb dryer and tea blender. His cottage was surrounded by the most aromatic garden in the village, filled with chamomile, mint, lemon balm, and a dozen other herbs that he dried and blended into teas for the local establishments. "He supplies the Blue Boar with a house blend," Mrs. Pike continued, "and does special mixes for the Women's Institute meetings. Very particular about his teas is Abel. Won't use anything but the best water, and times everything to the minute." She shook her head with the slight impatience of someone who valued efficiency above artistry. "Still, each to their own way of earning a living, I suppose." Miss Marple nodded with the gentle understanding of one who had observed human nature in all its varieties. "Mr. Toms has always struck me as a man who takes pride in his craft. There's something to be said for that in these modern times." As Mrs. Pike continued on her way, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the quiet tea-maker. She had encountered him just the evening before, as she had taken her customary walk along the lane after supper. He'd been in his garden tending to a patch of lemon balm with the careful attention of a surgeon, his thin hands moving among the leaves with practiced precision. They had exchanged pleasantries about the coming spring, and he had mentioned something about a new blend he was developing for the Blue Boar. The morning progressed with its usual rhythm. Miss Marple attended to her correspondence, had her breakfast, and was settling down with her knitting when she heard the sound of raised voices from the direction of the lane. Through her sitting-room window, she could see Dr. Hawk's motor car parked at an unusual angle, and beyond it, the unmistakable bulk of Inspector Slack's official vehicle. Curiosity, that most natural of human impulses, prompted Miss Marple to set aside her knitting and make her way toward the commotion. As she approached Abel Toms's cottage, she could see a small crowd had gathered. Mrs. Pike stood with her arms crossed, speaking in animated tones to Inspector Slack, while Dr. Haddock examined something near the herb shed that stood beside the cottage. "The door's been forced," Inspector Slack was saying in his characteristically brusque manner. Mrs. Pike here found it locked up tight this morning, but there was no sign of Tom's anywhere about. The herb shed was a modest structure of weathered wood and corrugated iron, where Abel dried his herbs and blended his teas. Miss Marple could see that the door hung slightly askew on its hinges, and there was a strong, almost overwhelming scent of Earl Grey tea hanging in the air around the building. "Most peculiar," Dr. Haddock was murmuring, his kindly face creased with concern. "The latch appears to have been dropped from the inside, but there's no other way out of the shed." Miss Marple approached the group quietly, her keen eyes taking in the scene. The herb shed's single window was grimy and intact, and through it she could just make out the familiar shapes of Abel's equipment: the large kettle he used for steaming herbs, the wooden drying racks, and the various jars and containers that held his supplies. "When did you last see Mr. Tom's?" Inspector Slack asked Mrs. Pike, his notebook at the ready. "Yesterday evening around dusk," Mrs. Pike replied promptly. "He was trimming his lemon balm, just as Miss Marple here can confirm. I saw her speaking with him as I was closing up the post office." All eyes turned to Miss Marple, who nodded slowly. "Yes, I did see Mr. Tom's yesterday evening. He seemed quite himself, perhaps even a bit excited about some new blend he was working on. He mentioned something about convincing Mr. Blee to try it at the shop." Harold Blee, the village grocer and provisioner, was a man of considerable local importance, who had recently begun pushing his own line of teas in competition with the more established brands. He was known for his forceful personality and his ability to dominate any conversation about matters commercial. Inspector Slack grunted, making a note. "And this morning, Mrs. Pike?" "I came by around 7 for my usual milk round," Mrs. Pike explained. "The cottage seemed quiet enough, but when I passed the shed, I noticed that strong smell of Earl Grey. Thought it odd, since Abel usually did his blending in the afternoons. I called out but got no answer, and when I tried the door, I found it was latched from within." Miss Marple stepped close to the forced door and peered inside. The earthen floor just inside the threshold bore an odd star-shaped wet patch, with what appeared to be a faint ring of white crystals around its edge. The kettle sat cold on its hob, and the various implements of Abel's trade were arranged with his usual precision, but the man himself was nowhere to be seen. "Most curious," she murmured, then looked up at Inspector Slack. "Has anyone checked with the Blue Boar?" Mr. Tom's was expected to deliver his weekly order. Before Inspector Slack could answer, the sound of a motor horn echoed from the direction of the high street, followed by the rumble of a heavy vehicle. Through the gap between cottages, they could see a large lorry making its way toward the Blue Boar Inn. "That'll be Bert Cole with a tea delivery from Benham," Dr. Haddock observed. "Regular as clockwork he is," Miss Marple's pale blue eyes sharpened with interest. There was something about the convergence of these events: Abel's mysterious disappearance, the locked shed, and the arrival of the tea delivery, that struck her as more than mere coincidence. In her long experience of village life, she'd learned that apparent coincidences often mask deeper connections. As the group began to disperse, with Inspector Slack muttering about city criminals and locked-room nonsense, Miss Marple lingered by the herb shed. She approached the cold kettle and with a delicate finger touched the spout. There was something there, an oily residue that carried a familiar scent. Bergamot. She frowned slightly, for she knew Abel Toms to be a man who despised what he called scented teas and would never have used bergamot oil in his blends. Yet here it was, clinging to his kettle like an accusation. The morning sun climbed higher, burning away the mist and revealing the sharp edges of what promised to be a most puzzling day indeed. Chapter 2. Locked from within, the Blue Boar stood at the heart of St. Mary Mead like a comfortable old gentleman, its timber beams and whitewashed walls having witnessed countless generations of village life. Miss Marple made her way there just before noon, drawn by an inexplicable sense that the threads of Abel Tom's disappearance might somehow be woven into the fabric of the inn's daily routine. She found Inspector Slack in the inn's courtyard, hands on his hips, glowering at the large lorry that had recently arrived. Bert Cole, the driver, was a wiry man with grease-stained hands and the perpetually harried expression of someone who lived by timetables not entirely of his own making. 3 chests, regular as always. Bert was explaining to the inspector with the patient tone of a man repeating himself. All loaded at Benham, tea and provisions this morning, all properly sealed and manifested. I don't know anything about your missing tea maker. Inspector Slack's expression suggested he found this information less than satisfactory. Locked room mystery at one end, and now you turn up with tea chests at the other. Bit convenient, wouldn't you say? Inspector? Miss Marple interjected gently. Surely you don't suspect poor Mr. Cole of skullduggery. The Benham delivery has been as regular as Sunday service for years. Slack turned to her with the expression of a man whose authority was being quietly undermined. Miss Marple, this is police business. We have a man vanished from a locked room, and I'll thank you not to... He was interrupted by a tremendous thump from the direction of the cellar entrance, followed by a string of colorful language from the porter, who was attempting to maneuver one of the tea chests down the stone steps. Blasted things. Heavier than they look, the porter called up. Feels like there's more than tea in this one. Dr. Haddock, who had been examining the forced door of the herb shed with scientific interest, looked up sharply. Heavy, you say? Perhaps we should have a look. What followed was a scene that would remain etched in Miss Marple's memory for years to come. The porter, with considerable effort and the assistance of Bert Cole, maneuvered the chest back up from the cellar. When they pried off the lid with a crowbar, the false bottom gave way with a sound like thunder. Beneath layers of muslin and tinfoil lay the still form of Abel Tom's. Dr. Haddock's examination was swift and professional. Dead for several hours, he pronounced grimly. Blunt force trauma to the temple and signs of asphyxiation. Poor fellow was struck, then confined in this box. Inspector Slack's face had gone from red to purple to an alarming shade of white. Lorry men, he muttered, then louder. City thieves. This is none of your village nonsense. This is organized crime come down from London. But Miss Marple had approached the chest and was kneeling beside it with the careful attention of a botanist, examining a rare specimen. Her sharp eyes had already noted several details that seemed to tell a different story entirely. Inspector, she said softly, might I point out a few things before you alert Scotland Yard? Slack's response was predictably explosive, but Dr. Haddock intervened with the calm authority of a man accustomed to dealing with both the living and the dead. Let us speak, Slack. Miss Marple has an eye for these things. With gentle precision, Miss Marple indicated 3 items that she had carefully teased from the chest's construction. First, a shipping label that had been pasted over another label, the adhesive still faintly damp to the touch. Second, a small tuft of jute fiber with a distinctive blue thread running through it, caught beneath one of the chest's metal reinforcing strips. Third, and perhaps most curious of all, a strand of spiderweb that had been broken and then reattached to one of the chest nails with what appeared to be a deliberate knot. The label suggests this chest has been repurposed, she observed. The jute fiber indicates local cordage. That blue tracer thread is quite distinctive. And as for the spider web, she paused delicately. I've never known a spider to tie a half-hitch knot. Inspector Slack stared at the evidence with the expression of a man watching his theories crumble. But the shed was locked from within. How could anyone have gotten out? Aha, Miss Marple said, rising slowly to her feet. Perhaps we should return to examine that more carefully. Back at Abel's cottage, the herb shed presented its puzzle anew. The drop latch mechanism was simple enough, a heavy iron bar that fell by gravity into a staple, securing the door from the inside. Above the door's interior rail, Miss Marple's keen eyes detected a shallow groove and a faint, greasy residue. Someone has been quite clever, she mused, running her finger along the mark. See here, Inspector. This groove suggests something was wedged against the latch to hold it up. But what? Slack demanded. And how could they remove it from outside? Miss Marple knelt by the threshold and examined the star-shaped wet patch more closely. Around its edges, those curious white crystals caught the afternoon light, scattered diamonds. Salt, she said with quiet certainty. These are salt crystals. She looked up at the others. And notice how the floor beneath the latch staple is quite dry while there's still dampness in the outer courtyard. Water flowed outward from this spot, not inward. Dr. Haddock's eyebrows rose with understanding. You're suggesting someone used ice to wedge the latch? Ice pressed with a pinch of salt to make it melt more quickly, Miss Marple confirmed. As it thawed, the latch would fall naturally into place, and the melt water would flow outward, carrying the salt with it. The door would appear to have been latched from within, when, in fact, the person responsible had already departed. She moved to examine the door frame more carefully, noting additional small details that painted a picture of careful premeditation. On the exterior sill, more grains of coarse salt glittered in the crevices of the weathered wood. Quite ingenious, really, she continued. One could secure the latch mechanism, depart at leisure, and rely on simple physics to create the appearance of an impossible crime. The smell of Earl Grey would mask any other odor and suggest that Abel had been working normally. Inspector Slack's skepticism wore with grudging admiration. All very clever, Miss Marple, but it still doesn't explain how our man ended up in that tea chest or who put him there. No, indeed, she agreed. But it does suggest that we're dealing with someone who understands both the mechanics of deception and the rhythms of village life. Someone who knew that Mrs. Pike makes her morning rounds at 7, that Dr. Haddock would be called to examine the locked shed, and that the Benham delivery arrives precisely at noon. Bert Cole shifted uncomfortably. Now see here, I don't know anything about locked sheds or missing tea makers. I just drive the lorry and deliver what I'm told to deliver. Of course you do, Miss Marple said soothingly, though I wonder if you might have noticed anything unusual about this morning's load. The porter mentioned that one chest seemed heavier than expected. Bert's face took on the expression of a man walking through a minefield. Well, now that you mention it, the last chest did seem a bit awkward when I loaded it. But they all looked proper enough, standard Benham markings, properly nailed and sealed. And you loaded all 3 chests yourself at the Benham depot? That I did, same as always. He paused, frowning. Come to think of it, Harold Blee was hanging about the depot this morning, said something about checking on his special order. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Dr. Haddock. Harold Blee's presence at the depot added yet another strand to the increasingly complex web of circumstances surrounding Abel's death. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the curious combination of village knowledge and criminal cunning that had created this elaborate deception. Someone had understood not only the technical aspects of creating a locked room mystery, but also the social rhythms that would bring the crime to light at precisely the right moment. The question that remained was whether this someone had acted alone, or whether the conspiracy reached deeper into the apparently peaceful fabric of St. Mary Mead than anyone yet suspected. Standing in Abel's quiet garden, surrounded by the herbs that would never again know his careful tending, Miss Marple reflected that murder, like tea blending, required both skill and timing to achieve the desired effect. Chapter 3. Miss Marple Notices Bergamot. The following morning brought with it the kind of crisp clarity that often follows revelation, as though the very air had been cleansed by truth. Miss Marple sat in her morning room with a cup of her own carefully prepared tea, Darjeeling, perfectly timed, and contemplated the curious matter of scents and their significance. Lady Bantry arrived just as the clock struck 10, sweeping into the cottage with characteristic energy and an armful of early daffodils from her own garden. "Dolly," Miss Marple greeted her friend warmly. "How kind of you to call. I was just thinking about yesterday's dreadful events." "Indeed." "Jane, the whole village is buzzing with it." Lady Bantry arranged herself in the familiar chintz armchair and fixed Miss Marple with an expectant look. "Though I suspect you've already seen something the rest of us have missed." "You have that particular expression?" Miss Marple smiled gently. "There are several things that strike me as curious, Dolly, but perhaps the most peculiar is the matter of the bergamot." "Bergamot?" "The oil that gives Earl Grey tea its distinctive scent. Yesterday morning, Abel's shed reeked of it, yet there wasn't a single broad leaf to be found anywhere in the building. Most extraordinary when you consider that Abel despised scented teas." "Despised them? Are you quite certain?" "Oh, absolutely. He once told me that bergamot was the ruination of perfectly good tea, and that the English palate was being corrupted by foreign fancies. He was quite passionate about it, actually. Said that a proper cup of tea should taste of tea. Nothing more and nothing less." This intelligence clearly surprised Lady Bantry, who had evidently not given much thought to Abel Toms's philosophical position on tea adulteration. Then what on earth was that smell doing in his shed? Miss Marple rose and moved to the window where she could see across the village green to the high street. "That, my dear, is precisely what I wondered. So I took the liberty of examining Abel's equipment more carefully this morning, before Inspector Slack could have it all carted away as evidence." She had, in fact, returned to the herb shed at dawn when the dew still clung to the hedge, and the village lay quiet under a pale sky. What she had discovered there had confirmed her growing suspicions about the theatrical nature of Abel's supposed tea-making session. "I found traces of bergamot oil on the kettle spout," she continued, "and also on the chimney cap of his little stove. But here's the curious thing, Dolly. There was also a faint grease ring on the hob where something small had sat. Something that had never been heated." "What sort of something?" "A small container, I should think. Something that held bergamot oil and was placed there to create the impression of recent use, but was removed before the stove was lit. The kettle itself had been rinsed with soft water, rainwater, judging by the particular type of scale it left, rather than the hard well water Abel always used for his blending." Lady Bantry leaned forward with growing interest. "You mean someone was creating a false impression of tea-making?" "Precisely. The bergamot scent, the evidence of recent activity, even the timing, all carefully arranged to suggest that Abel had been working in his shed that morning, when in fact he had already been—" Miss Marple paused delicately, when he was no longer able to work at all. The two ladies sat in contemplative silence for a moment before Lady Bantry spoke again. "This puts rather a different complexion on Harold Blee's recent activities, doesn't it?" Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she resumed her knitting. "What activities would those be, dear?" "Oh, haven't you heard? He's been going about the village for weeks now, pushing some new tea blend he calls Blee Country Earl. Quite aggressive about it, actually. Mrs. Fletcher at the bakery said he practically insisted she try it, claimed it was superior to anything the London suppliers could provide." This information settled into place in Miss Marple's mind, like the final piece of a jigsaw puzzle, finding its proper position. And did Mrs. Fletcher express an opinion about this new blend? She said it tasted rather odd, too floral somehow, and with an aftertaste that reminded her of autumn leaves. Lady Bantry paused, considering. Come to think of it, she mentioned that Harold claimed Abel Toms himself had endorsed the mixture, said Abel was coming round to the advantages of a properly blended Earl Grey. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused in their rhythm. How very interesting, especially given Abel's well-known antipathy to bergamot-scented teas. You think Harold was lying? I think, my dear Dolly, that Mr. Blee may have been taking considerable liberties with the truth. The question is whether those liberties extended beyond mere commercial exaggeration. After Lady Bantry departed, Miss Marple found herself drawn once again to Abel's cottage and the now silent herb shed. The police constable on duty recognized her, and with the weary resignation of one who had learned not to argue with village institutions, allowed her to examine the scene once more. In the clear morning light, additional details presented themselves. The water butt outside the shed showed clear signs of recent use. Its level was notably lower than one would expect after recent rains, and its wooden lid bore a small brick that appeared to have been placed there to hold it down against wind, though no wind had blown for several days. Inside the shed, Miss Marple examined the cold kettle more carefully. The milky bloom of scale that had formed around its interior walls was indeed characteristic of soft rainwater rather than the mineral-heavy well water that fed Abel's cottage. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create the appearance of normal tea preparation while using entirely the wrong materials for the purpose. The little stove told its own story. The chimney cap bore traces of bergamot oil that had clearly been applied by hand, and the firebox contained no recent ash, evidence that no actual heating had taken place. The grease ring on the hob was perfectly circular, suggesting a small jar or bottle had been placed there temporarily, perhaps while someone worked to distribute the bergamot scent around the shed. Most telling of all was what was missing. Abel's work diary, in which he meticulously recorded his blending experiments, was nowhere to be found. His measuring scales, usually kept spotlessly clean, showed traces of unfamiliar plant matter, tiny fragments of what appeared to be dried leaves, but not tea leaves. Miss Marple collected several of these fragments in her handkerchief, intending to examine them more closely at home. She had a suspicion about their origin based on Lady Bantry's description of the odd taste of Harold Blee's country blend. As she prepared to leave the shed, she noticed one final detail that had escaped her attention the previous day. In the corner where Abel kept his reference books, volumes on botany, tea cultivation, and blending techniques, several texts lay open, their pages marked with what appeared to be hasty fingerprints. Your open pages dealt with the identification of adulterants in commercial tea blends and the legal penalties for selling adulterated food products, walking back through the village. Miss Marple reflected on the emerging picture of Abel Toms's final days. It seemed increasingly likely that the quiet tea maker had discovered something about Harold Blee's new product that had signed his own death. Warrant, the bergamot-centered charade in the herb shed, had been designed not just to conceal the time of Abel's death, but to associate him, even posthumously, with the very practice he had spent his final days investigating. The irony was not lost on her that a man who had despised artificial scents in tea should have his death disguised by the very essence he had found so objectionable. Murder, she reflected, often possesses a cruel sense of poetic justice that speaks more to the killer's character than to any higher design. As she reached her garden gate, Miss Marple made a mental note to pay a visit to Harold Blee's establishment. There were questions to be asked about his country blend, and she suspected that the answers might prove most illuminating indeed. Chapter 4. Rainwater in the Kettle, Afternoon sun cast long shadows across St. Mary Mead as Miss Marple made her way along the high street, her keen eyes taking note of the various establishments that formed the commercial heart of the village. Her destination was Harold Blee's shop, but she found herself pausing first at the small tea room run by Mrs. Carmichael, where the gentle clink of china and murmur of conversation provided a familiar backdrop to village life. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Carmichael called from behind the counter, her round face creased with concern. "Such dreadful business about poor Mr. Tom's. Who would have thought such a thing could happen here?" "Indeed it is most disturbing," Miss Marple replied, settling herself at a small table by the window. "I wonder if I might trouble you for a cup of tea, and perhaps you could tell me. Have you noticed anything unusual about the tea supplies lately?" Mrs. Carmichael bustled about preparing the tea with the practiced efficiency of one who had served countless cups over the years. "Well, now that you mention it, there has been some talk. Mr. Blee has been most insistent that we all try his new blend. Blee Country Earl, he calls it. Says it's superior to anything from London, and that even Abel Toms had given it his approval." She set the teacup before Miss Marple with a slight frown. "But between you and me, Miss Marple, I found that rather hard to believe. Abel was most particular about his teas, and I'd never known him to favor anything with bergamot in it." Said it masked the true character of the leaf. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. It was properly brewed, with a clear amber color that spoke of good leaves and careful timing. "Did you try Mr. Blee's new blend?" "I did, though I wished I hadn't. Tasted rather peculiar, if I'm being honest. Too sweet somehow, and with an odd bitterness underneath. When I mentioned it to Harold, he said I simply wasn't accustomed to proper Earl Grey." "But I've been serving tea for 30 years, Miss Marple. I know what proper tea should taste like." After finishing her tea, Miss Marple made her way to Harold Blee's establishment. The shop occupied a prominent position on the high street, its windows filled with displays of tinned goods, preserves, and prominently featured packages of Blee Country Earl tea, a superior local blend. Harold Blee himself was a man of substantial girth and even more substantial opinions, who had built his business on a combination of aggressive salesmanship and an intimate knowledge of village gossip. He greeted Miss Marple with a slightly condescending bonhomie he reserved for elderly ladies whom he considered harmless. "Miss Marple, how delightful to see you. I trust you're bearing up well under the shock of poor Abel's unfortunate end. Such a tragedy when city criminals bring their violence to peaceful villages like ours." Miss Marple accepted his offered chair and smiled gently. "Thank you, Mr. Blee, though I must say, Inspector Slack seems less certain about the involvement of outside criminals. He's been asking the most searching questions about local affairs." Something flickered behind Harold's jovial expression. "Has he indeed? Well, I suppose he must be thorough, though I can't imagine what local affairs could possibly be relevant to such an obvious case of robbery gone wrong." "Perhaps you're right," Miss Marple agreed mildly, "though I confess I've been puzzled by certain technical details. For instance, the matter of the water in Abel's kettle." "Water?" "Yes, the most curious thing. You see, Abel always used water from his own well for his tea-making. Terribly hard water, full of minerals, that left the most distinctive scale deposits on his equipment. But on the morning he disappeared, his kettle showed the soft, milky scale that only comes from rainwater." She paused, studying Harold's face with the innocent attention of a curious elderly lady. "It made me wonder why anyone would go to the trouble of using rainwater when they had a perfectly good well at hand. Rainwater is softer, of course, but it doesn't brew as strong a cup. Rather defeats the purpose, unless one was simply trying to create an impression rather than an actual beverage." Harold shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "I'm sure I wouldn't know anything about Abel's water preferences, Miss Marple. We all have our little peculiarities when it comes to such things." "Oh, indeed we do," She tilted her head gently. Which reminds me, I've been hearing such interesting things about your new tea blend. Mrs. Carmichael mentioned that you'd said Abel endorsed it. The color in Harold's cheeks deepened slightly. Well, not endorsed exactly, but he had expressed interest in the concept of a locally sourced Earl Grey. We had several discussions about it. How fascinating. Though I must admit I was rather surprised to hear that. You see, Abel once told me quite emphatically that bergamot was the ruination of perfectly good tea. He felt quite strongly about it. Actually said the English palate was being corrupted by such foreign additions. Harold's laugh sounded forced. Well, people can change their minds, can't they? Perhaps he was coming around to a more modern way of thinking. Miss Marple tilted her head. Perhaps, though it would have been quite a dramatic change of heart. Tell me, what gives your blend its particular character? I understand it has a rather distinctive taste. Trade secrets, Miss Marple. Can't go revealing all one's methods to the competition, can one? Harold's attempt at jocularity fell somewhat flat. Of course not. Though I couldn't help but notice that your water butt behind the shop appears to have been used recently. The level is quite low despite our recent rains. One might almost think someone had been drawing soft water for some special purpose. The silence that followed was pregnant with tension. Harold's hands, Miss Marple noted, had developed a slight tremor, and a thin film of perspiration had appeared on his forehead despite the coolness of the day. I use rainwater for various purposes, he said finally. Cleaning, mainly. The minerals in well water can leave such unsightly deposits on glass and metal. How practical of you. And speaking of cleaning, I noticed that your hands have the faintest trace of bergamot about them. Such a distinctive scent. It tends to linger, doesn't it? Harold's hands moved instinctively to his pockets. I've been handling samples of the new blend. Testing batches, you understand. Miss Marple rose to leave, gathering her handbag and gloves with careful deliberation. Of course. Well, I mustn't take up any more of your valuable time. Thank you for the enlightening conversation. As she reached the door, she turned back with an afterthought. Oh, Mr. Blee, I hope you won't think me impertinent, but I couldn't help noticing that small brick on your water butt lid. Such a sensible precaution against the wind, though we haven't had any strong breezes lately, have we? Harold's reply was barely audible. One can never be too careful. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple reflected on the web of small deceptions that was beginning to emerge around Abel Toms's death. The rainwater in the kettle, the misplaced brick, the lingering scent of bergamot on Harold's fingers. Each detail was small in itself, but together they painted a picture of careful preparation and deliberate misdirection. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to stage Abel's final tea-making session, using soft water to create the proper scale deposits and bergamot oil to provide the convincing aroma. The question that remained was whether this elaborate charade had been designed merely to conceal the time of death or whether it served some deeper purpose in a scheme that reached into the very heart of village commerce. As she reached her garden gate, Miss Marple paused to examine her own water butt. The brick that held its lid in place was weathered and moss-covered, clearly undisturbed for months. Unlike some others she could mention, whose bricks appeared to have been moved quite recently indeed. The truth, she reflected, often lay not in grand gestures, but in the smallest details. A misplaced brick, the wrong kind of water, a scent where none should be. Murder might masquerade as mystery, but it could never entirely escape the evidence of its own making. Chapter 5. The Chest. That thumped. The morning brought Inspector Slack to Miss Marple's cottage in a state of considerable agitation. His usual bluster tempered by what appeared to be genuine bewilderment. He found her in the garden, deadheading early roses with the methodical care of one who understood that attention to small details often prevented larger problems. Miss Marple, he began without preamble. I'll admit I'm at something of a standstill. This business with the tea-chest has me properly puzzled. Miss Marple set down her secateurs and gave him her full attention. In what way, Inspector? Well, it's the weight of the thing, you see. According to Bert Cole's manifest from Benham, each chest should weigh 76 lb, standard weight for their tea shipments, apparently. But Mrs. Pike, you know how precise she is with her postal scales. She weighed that particular chest yesterday afternoon and recorded 86 lb in her book. 10 pounds difference, Miss Marple observed thoughtfully. That would be roughly the weight of a man's head and torso. Yes, Inspector Slack admitted grimly. Which means someone added Abel Toms to that chest after it left the Benham depot, but before it reached the Blue Boar. Miss Marple walked slowly toward her garden gate, her mind working through the implications. That would suggest local involvement, wouldn't it? Someone who had access to the chest during its journey. That's just it. According to Bert Cole, the chest never left his sight from the time he loaded it at Benham until he delivered it to the Blue Boar. Claims he made no stops, spoke to no one, and certainly didn't open any of his cargo. They walked together toward the Blue Boar, where the infamous chest still sat in the courtyard, now thoroughly examined by the police, but somehow more sinister for all its ordinariness. The porter, who had first struggled with its weight, stood nearby smoking his pipe and regarding the wooden box with evident distaste. Tell Miss Marple what you told me about the chest, Inspector Slack instructed. The porter, a weathered man named Jenkins, who had worked at the Blue Boar for the better part of 2 decades, removed his pipe and nodded respectfully. It thumped different, Miss Marple. Not like the usual tea chests at all. They make a sort of sliding sound when you move them, the loose tea shifting about inside. But this one, it was more like moving a sack of potatoes. Solid-like, if you take my meaning. Miss Marple examined the chest more carefully, noting details that had escaped her. Attention during yesterday's dramatic discovery. The tin foil lining that had concealed the false bottom was remarkably sophisticated, wax rubbed along the edges to allow it to slide smoothly. The craftsmanship spoke of someone with considerable experience in working with such containers. Most ingenious, she murmured, running her fingers along the interior edges. This false bottom wasn't hastily improvised. It was carefully constructed by someone who understood the mechanics of concealment. Inspector Slack pointed to the nails along one edge of the chest. Notice anything odd about those? Indeed, Miss Marple did. The nails were bent outward rather than inward, suggesting they had been pried loose and then rehammered. This chest has been opened and resealed, she observed. Someone has used it before? Exactly what I thought. But here's the curious thing. Bert Cole swears all 3 chests were properly sealed when he loaded them at Benham. No signs of tampering, all the nails hammered true and tight. Miss Marple frowned slightly. Then the tampering must have occurred before the chest reached Benham? Or Mr. Cole isn't being entirely truthful about his delivery route. They found Bert Cole at the village pub, nursing a pint and looking thoroughly miserable. He was a wiry, nervous man with a permanent stoop of someone who spent his days loading and unloading heavy cargo. When Inspector Slack approached, his expression became even more haunted. I've told you everything I know, he said before they could speak. 3 chests loaded at Benham. 3 chests delivered to the Blue Boar. Nothing more to it than that. Miss Marple settled herself at his table with the gentle persistence of a favorite aunt. Mr. Cole, I'm sure you're telling us the truth as you see it. But perhaps you might help us understand the technical aspects of your work. For instance, how do you normally secure your cargo? Standard practice, Bert replied, relaxing slightly under her kindly manner. Each chest gets nailed shut at the depot, then loaded onto the lorry. I check the manifest, secure the load with ropes, and make my deliveries according to schedule. Yesterday's load was no different. Not Exactly, Bert hesitated, then continued reluctantly. Harold Blee was hanging about the depot when I was loading. Said he had some special interest in the Blue Boar shipment. Something about checking on quality control for his new tea blend. Inspector Slack leaned forward sharply. Harold Blee was at the Benham depot? He was. Claimed he had some sort of arrangement with them about sourcing local suppliers. Seemed to know his way around well enough. Miss Marple's eyes sharpened with interest. Did Mr. Blee examine any of the chests? He did, actually. Said he wanted to check the stenciling on one particular chest, the one bound for the Blue Boar. Spent quite a bit of time looking it over. Even asked me to help him shift it so he could see the bottom. The implications of this revelation hung in the air like morning fog. Inspector Slack's face had taken on the expression of a man whose theories were rapidly reshaping themselves. And you saw nothing unusual about the chest after Mr. Blee's examination? Well, Bert hesitated, then continued reluctantly. There was one thing. When I loaded it back onto the lorry, it did seem a bit heavier than I remembered. The chests can be tricky things. Sometimes you lift them at a bad angle and they feel different. Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. Of course they can. Tell me, did Mr. Blee arrive at the depot before or after you? Before. He was already there when I pulled up, talking to the foreman about something or other. Seemed quite friendly with the staff, actually. After they left Bert cold to his troubled contemplations, Miss Marple and Inspector Slack walked in thoughtful silence toward the post office. Mrs. Pike was behind her counter, efficiently sorting the afternoon mail with the mechanical precision of long practice. Mrs. Pike, Miss Marple began, Inspector Slack tells me you weighed the tea-chest yesterday. Might we see your records? Nora Pike produced her weight book with obvious pride. Her entries were models of precision, each item carefully recorded with time, weight, and destination. The entry for the Blue Boar chest was written in a clear, angular hand. 40 p.m. Chest to Blue Boar, 86 lubby. Heavy. You noted it as heavy? Miss Marple observed. Indeed I did. 10 pounds over what it should have been, according to my experience with similar shipments. I even mentioned to Harold Blee that if it had been going by post, it would have required additional postage. Mr. Blee was here when you weighed it? Oh yes, he was most interested in the proceedings. Said he wanted to ensure his business arrangements were being handled properly. Watched me weigh it twice, actually, as if he didn't trust my scales. Miss Marple exchanged a meaningful glance with Inspector Slack. Did he seem surprised by the weight? Mrs. Pike considered this carefully. Now that you mention it, no. If anything, he seemed satisfied, as if the weight confirmed something he had expected. As they left the post office, Inspector Slack's expression had settled into one of grim determination. It's beginning to look as though Harold Blee had considerably more involvement in this affair than he's admitted. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. The question is whether he acted alone, or whether he had assistance in what appears to have been a rather complex undertaking. The evidence was mounting like pieces of an intricate puzzle, each revelation adding another layer to the picture of premeditation and careful planning that surrounded Abel Toms's death. The chest that had thumped differently was speaking its own language of guilt and conspiracy. If only they could learn to read it properly. Chapter 6. Label written over. Afternoon had settled into that peculiar stillness that often precedes important revelations when Miss Marple found herself once again drawn to examine the fatal tea-chest. This time, however, she was accompanied by Lily Crowther, the village seamstress whose keen eye for fabric and thread had made her an invaluable observer of the more technical aspects of the case. Lily was a woman of perhaps 50 years, with the precise manner and careful gaze that came from a lifetime of working with materials that demanded exactitude. She had arrived at Miss Marple's cottage that morning with a bag of mending and a head full of observations about the peculiarity she had noticed in the evidence. It's the craftsmanship that bothers me, Lily was saying as they approached the Blue Boar's courtyard. That false bottom wasn't the work of an amateur. Someone with proper woodworking skills constructed it. Someone who understood both carpentry and concealment. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. What strikes you most about the construction? The precision of the fit, for one thing, Lily replied, crouching beside the chest. And the way the tinfoil lining was installed. That's not something you'd learn from casual experience. It speaks of someone who has worked with shipping containers before, someone who understands how goods are packed and transported. They bent together over the chest, examining the stenciled markings that declared its contents. Salon broken orange Pico, blue cellar. But Miss Marple's attention was drawn to the edges of the paper waybill, where the adhesive had begun to curl slightly in the afternoon warmth. With delicate fingers, she lifted the corner of the label. Beneath it, partially visible in faded purple ink, were the ghostly remains of another marking, soaps and candles, Blee and Sun. How very interesting, she murmured. This chest has had a previous incarnation, it would seem. Lily leaned closer, her professional interest piqued. That adhesive is still quite fresh, she observed. British gum mucilage, I should think, and not more than a day or two old. See how it's still slightly tacky to the touch? You learn about adhesives as well as fabrics when you're mending sacks and repairing containers. That particular gum is quite distinctive. It has a yellowish tinge and a specific odor when fresh. This intelligence prompted Miss Marple to suggest a visit to Harold Blee's establishment, where they might examine his storage arrangements more closely. They found the grocer in his back room, ostensibly checking inventory, but with the distracted air of a man whose thoughts were elsewhere entirely. The back room was a fascinating study in commercial organization. Crates and boxes were stacked with military precision, each bearing Harold's characteristic purple stenciling, soaps and candles, Blee and Sun. On a workbench near the window sat a bottle of British gum mucilage, its spout torn and stained with dried adhesive. Quite an efficient system you have here. Mr. Blee, Miss Marple commented pleasantly. Do you often reuse your containers? Harold started slightly at their entrance, but recovered his composure with practiced ease. Everyone recycles crates these days, Miss Marple. Waste not, want not, as they say. No sense in throwing away perfectly good wood. Lily had moved to examine some of the stacked crates, her seamstress's eye taking in the details of construction and marking. These are beautifully stenciled, she observed. Such clean, precise lettering. You must have quite a steady hand. Years of practice, Harold replied, though his voice carried a note of unease. A shopkeeper learns to make his own signage if he wants to succeed. Miss Marple had noticed several hand-lettered placards propped against the wall, advertisements for various goods and services that Harold provided. The lettering was indeed distinctive, with a particular flourish to the letter R that curved like a fishhook. Your penmanship is quite characteristic, she noted. That decorative R is most individual. I don't believe I've seen quite that style before. Harold's hands moved instinctively toward his pockets, a gesture Miss Marple had begun to recognize as significant. Just a personal quirk, I suppose. We all develop our own ways of doing things. Lily had been examining the adhesive bottle more closely. This gum is quite fresh, she commented. The torn spout suggests recent heavy use. Do you do much labeling, Mr. Blee? Some, when I need to redirect shipments or update inventory markings. Harold's answer came too quickly, with the practiced smoothness of a man who had prepared his explanations in advance. Miss Marple moved to examine a stack of waybills and shipping forms that lay on Harold's desk. Among them was a partially completed form in Harold's distinctive handwriting, the fishhook R clearly visible in the word proprietor. Such neat record-keeping, she observed, though I noticed this particular form has a rather unusual scent about it. She lifted the paper delicately to her nose. Bergamot, unless I'm mistaken. The color drained from Harold's face. I may have handled it while testing samples of my new tea blend. These things happen in a busy shop. But Lily had made another discovery. Among the shipping forms was a blank waybill that bore a distinct crescent-shaped smudge near one corner, the sort of mark a thumb might leave if pressed against the paper, while the digit carried traces of some oily substance. Mr. Blee, Miss Marple said gently, I wonder if you might explain something that has been puzzling me. The chest that contained poor Abel's body bore a fresh label over your original soaps and candles marking. The adhesive was still tacky, suggesting very recent application, and the handwriting on the waybill matches your distinctive style exactly. Harold's composure finally cracked. Now see here, Miss Marple, you can't go about making accusations without proof. Lots of people reuse containers and lots of people have similar handwriting. Indeed they do, she agreed mildly. But I suspect very few have left their fingerprints on spare waybills that also bear traces of bergamot oil. And fewer still would have access to both the original container and the means to modify it so expertly. Lily nodded in agreement. The workmanship on that false bottom required both skill and time. It wasn't something thrown together in haste. Someone planned this very carefully indeed. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused at the door. Oh, Mr. Blee, I nearly forgot to mention. Mrs. Pike has been most helpful with her weight records. Such a precise woman and so careful about documenting unusual circumstances. I believe Inspector Slack found her observations particularly illuminating. Harold's response was barely audible, and his hands had developed a pronounced tremor. The confident shopkeeper of the morning had been replaced by a man who seemed to be watching his carefully. Constructed world began to collapse around him. Walking back through the village, Lily shook her head in amazement. To think that such elaborate planning went into poor Abel's murder. The relabeling alone must have taken considerable time and preparation. Indeed, Miss Marple agreed. And yet, for all that preparation, the perpetrator made the same mistake that most criminals make. He assumed that surface appearances would be sufficient to deceive without considering that truth has a way of showing through even the most careful disguises. The label written over another told its own story of deception and misdirection. But like all deceptions, it could not entirely erase the evidence of its own creation. Truth, Miss Marple reflected, was rather like quality fabric. It might be covered or disguised, but its essential character remained intact beneath whatever false surface had been applied to it. The evening shadows were lengthening as they reached Miss Marple's garden gate, and with them came the growing certainty that the web of evidence was drawing tight around Harold Blee's increasingly desperate attempts at concealment. Chapter 7. Jute with a Blue Thread. The following morning found Miss Marple in her sitting room, examining the small tuft of jute fiber she had retrieved from beneath the chest's metal reinforcing strip. The single blue tracer thread that ran through the natural brown fibers caught the morning light like a tiny beacon, and she found herself contemplating the significance of what might seem to others a trivial detail. Lily Crowther arrived promptly at 9 o'clock, as they had arranged, carrying with her a selection of cordage samples that she used in her mending work. Her professional expertise with textiles had proven invaluable in the investigation, and Miss Marple had asked her to examine the distinctive jute more closely. Most interesting, Lily murmured, holding the fiber up to the window. This blue tracer thread is quite specific to one supplier. Henshaw's Rope Works in Much Benham uses this particular shade of blue in their jute baling twine. They're rather proud of it. Actually claim it's their trademark. Miss Marple's eyes brightened with interest. And would this cordage be readily available in the village? Not particularly. Most shopkeepers use ordinary twine without tracers. The blue-threaded variety is primarily sold to commercial establishments that need to track their packaging materials. It's somewhat more expensive than regular cordage. This intelligence prompted them to undertake a survey of local establishments, beginning with the most obvious suspect. At Harold Blee's shop, they found him in an even more agitated state than the previous day. His usual bluster replaced by nervous energy that manifested in constant fidgeting and frequent glances toward the street. "Ladies," he greeted them with forced joviality. "How may I assist you this morning?" Miss Marple smiled pleasantly. "We're conducting a small survey about packaging materials, Mr. Blee. I wonder if you might show us what sort of twine you use for securing your goods?" Harold's expression flickered with uncertainty. "Twine? Well, that is, I use various types depending on the application. Standard hemp cord for most purposes, of course." Lily had already spotted what they were looking for. In a drawer behind the counter lay a ball of jute twine, nearly spent, but unmistakably marked with the distinctive blue tracer thread. She pointed it out with the calm precision of an expert witness. "That appears to be Henshaw's blue trace jute. Rather specialized cordage for general shop use, isn't it?" Harold's hands trembled slightly as he closed the drawer. "Bert Cole sometimes leaves bits and pieces when he makes deliveries. I keep them for convenience. Waste not, want not, you know." But Miss Marple had noticed something else that gave the lie to this casual explanation. The cut ends of the twine showed clear evidence of having been severed with a sharp knife, not torn or broken through normal use. Moreover, the amount remaining suggested that a considerable length had recently been removed. "Mr. Cole leaves such expensive cordage behind?" Miss Marple inquired gently. "How generous of him. Though I should have thought the transport company would account for their specialized materials more carefully." They made their way to the Blue Boar, where they found Bert Cole preparing for his next delivery run. The lorry driver looked even more haggard than before, his face bearing the drawn expression of a man who had slept poorly and worried much. "Mr. Cole," Lily began, "we're curious about the cordage you use for securing your loads. Would you happen to use jute twine with blue tracer threads?" Bert's response came with surprising vehemence. "Never. Benham provides all our securing materials, and they use their own sealed strapping system. I wouldn't dare substitute other cordage. They're very particular about maintaining their standards." Miss Marple studied his face carefully. "So you would never use blue trace jute twine for chest bindings?" "Absolutely not. Each chest gets sealed at the depot with Benham's own materials. The only twine I carry is for emergency repairs, and that's standard brown hemp. Anyone using blue-traced cordage for Benham shipments would be violating company policy." This revelation cast Harold Blee's explanation in an even more suspicious light. If Bert Cole never used the specialized cordage, how would it come to be in Harold's possession? And more importantly, how had it found its way into the fatal chest's binding materials? Their next stop was the post office, where Mrs. Pike was sorting the morning mail with her usual methodical precision. When shown the jute sample, she nodded with immediate recognition. "Oh yes, that's Henshaw's blue trace twine. I use it myself for securing heavy parcels. The post office purchases it specifically because the blue thread helps us identify our own packaging when items are returned or redirected." Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. "Have you noticed anyone else in the village using similar cordage?" "Not regularly, no. It's rather expensive for casual use." She paused, frowning slightly. "I did notice Harold Blee examining a length of it just last week. Said he was considering ordering some for his heavier shipments. Wanted to see if it was worth the additional cost. Did he purchase any from you?" "No, he said he would order directly from Henshaw's if he decided to make the change. Claimed he could get a better price buying in bulk." After leaving the post office, Miss Marple and Lily walked slowly back through the village, each lost in contemplation of what they had discovered. The blue trace twine is forming a clear pattern that connects Harold Blee to the chest's preparation. Lily observed, despite his protestations of innocence. The cordage in his shop, his examination of the postal supplies, his claim that Bert Cole left materials behind, none of it holds up to scrutiny. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. What troubles me most is the premeditation. One doesn't acquire specialized cordage on impulse. This was planned well in advance. They paused at the village green, where the afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient oak trees. Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of evidence, how truth revealed itself not in grand gestures, but in tiny details like the color of a thread or the cut of a cord. The interesting thing about blue trace twine, she mused aloud, is that it's designed to be noticed. Its purpose is identification and tracking. Yet in this case, someone used it hoping it wouldn't be detected at all. A rather foolish choice, Lily agreed. Or perhaps not so foolish as it appears, Miss Marple countered. Consider this. If the chest had been discovered elsewhere, or if the body had been found under different circumstances, that blue thread might have pointed suspicion toward the post office or some other establishment that legitimately uses such cordage. Lily's eyes widened with understanding. You mean it might have been intended as a false clue? Precisely. But the murderer couldn't have anticipated that Mrs. Pike would weigh the chest and notice the discrepancy, or that we would examine the binding so carefully. The blue thread was meant to mislead, but instead, it led us directly back to the one person who had both access to it and reason to use it deceptively. As they reached Miss Marple's garden gate, both women were struck by the same thought. The jute with its blue tracer thread was not merely evidence of guilt. It was evidence of a calculating mind that had attempted to turn the very tools of identification against themselves. Tomorrow, Miss Marple said quietly, I believe we should pay another visit to Mr. Blee's establishment. There are still questions to be answered about his acquisition of that cordage, and I suspect the answers will prove most illuminating indeed. The blue thread had woven its way through this case like a connecting strand, binding together all the elements of deception and revealing the careful planning that had gone into Abel Toms's murder. Truth, Miss Marple reflected, had a way of marking itself, even when those who sought to hide it believed they had been supremely clever. Chapter 8. Spiderweb on the Nail. Dawn mist clung to the hedge as Miss Marple made her solitary way back to Abel Toms's cottage, drawn by an intuition that the scene of the crime still held secrets yet to be discovered. The morning air carried the fresh scent of dew-dampened earth and the faint aroma of herbs that would forever haunt the little garden, now untended. She moved slowly through Abel's yard, her practiced eye taking in details that might have escaped notice during the initial excitement of discovery. The herb shed stood silent and somehow accusatory, its forced door hanging askew like an accusation against the violence that had been done there. But it was not the shed itself that drew her attention this morning. It was the ground around it, and particularly the terrier near the garden gate where Abel had kept his wheelbarrow. The soft earth showed clear impressions, and Miss Marple knelt carefully to examine them more closely. The ruts were deep and recent, pressed into the soil when it had been soft from recent rain, but before the morning sun had baked the surface hard. They spoke of a heavy load being transported, something far weightier than the usual herbs and gardening, supplies that Abel would have moved about his property, following the trail with the patience of a naturalist studying animal tracks. Miss Marple traced the wheelbarrow's path from the shed to the gate and beyond. The wheels had cut through the tender grass shoots near the hedge, crushing them down and leaving them glazed with the particular sheen that came when vegetation was pressed flat and then touched by morning dew. Most significantly, the track showed signs of having been made during the darkest hours. Grass that had been damaged in daylight would have wilted and browned, But these stalks bore the telltale evidence of nocturnal passage, when the cool air and moisture had preserved them in their flattened state. At the corner of the herb shed, where Abel had hung various tools and small implements, Miss Marple made a discovery that sent a small thrill of understanding through her methodical mind. A large nail protruded from the weathered wood, and caught upon it was a strand of spider web that had clearly been broken and then deliberately reattached. She examined the web fragment with the care of an archaeologist studying ancient artifacts. The original break was obvious, a clean separation that spoke of accidental contact. But the repair was another matter entirely. Someone had taken the trouble to reattach the broken strand to the nail, but had done so with a precise half-hitch knot that no spider had ever learned to tie. Fascinating, she murmured to herself, recognizing the handiwork of someone who understood both the need to restore appearances and the techniques of seamanship, or perhaps the loading trades. Her circuit of the yard revealed additional evidence of the midnight removal that had taken Abel Toms from his final resting place to his temporary grave in the tea-chest between the garden gate and the lane. A smear of tallow on the gatepost caught her attention, the sort of lubricant that careful workmen applied to wheel axles when they needed to move heavy loads quietly. The picture that emerged was one of methodical preparation and execution. Someone had transported Abel's body from the shed to the lane using his own wheelbarrow, taking care to muffle the wheels with tallow and to restore the broken spider web in an attempt to suggest that nothing had been disturbed. Miss Marple made her way to the Blue Boar, where she found Inspector Slack glumly contemplating the infamous tea-chest, as though it might suddenly reveal all its secrets through the force of his frustrated attention. "Inspector," she greeted him, "I've just returned from examining Abel's yard more carefully. I believe I may have discovered the route by which his body was transported from the murder scene." Slack looked up with the expression of a drowning man who had just been thrown a rope. "What sort of route?" Miss Marple described her findings: the wheelbarrow tracks, the crushed grass glazed with dew, the tallow smear on the gatepost, and most particularly, the spiderweb that had been broken and then reknotted with nautical precision. "Someone with considerable knowledge of knots took the trouble to repair that web," she explained. It wasn't a casual gesture. It was part of a deliberate attempt to conceal evidence of disturbance. But who in the village would have that sort of knowledge? Before Miss Marple could answer, Bert Cole appeared from the direction of his lorry, his weathered face bearing the expression of a man who had spent sleepless hours wrestling with his conscience. "Miss Marple," he began hesitantly, "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday, about the truth having a way of coming out. There's something I haven't told you about that night." Inspector Slack straightened with sudden attention. "What sort of something?" Bert shifted uncomfortably, his hands working at the brim of his cap. "Harold Blee came to me Tuesday evening. Said he had a special job that needed doing. Claimed there was a crate that needed collecting from Abel's place and delivering to the Blue Boar before the regular morning run." "A crate?" Miss Marple prompted gently. "He said it was samples of Abel's new blend, meant to be a surprise for the inn's customers. Harold said Abel had agreed to it, but wanted it done quietly, so as not to stir up talk before the official announcement." The story tumbled out in fits and starts, each detail adding another layer to the picture of Harold Blee's deception. Bert had been instructed to collect the crate from Abel's yard just after midnight, using Abel's own wheelbarrow to transport it quietly to where Harold waited with a proper tea-chest. "Harold had everything prepared," Bert continued miserably. "The chest, the tools for nailing it shut, even the waybill already written out. Said it was important to get it loaded onto my lorry before dawn so it would be part of the regular morning delivery." Miss Marple's expression remained carefully neutral. "And you saw nothing unusual about this arrangement?" I thought it was a bit odd, doing business in the middle of the night, but Harold said Abel was particular about secrecy. Didn't want his competitors knowing about the new blend until it was ready for market. Inspector Slack's face had grown increasingly red during this recital. So, you helped load a body into a tea chest and never thought to question what you were doing? I never knew it was a body, Bert protested. The chest was already prepared when I got there, and Harold said it contained tea samples. It was heavy, I admit, but so are proper tea chests when they're full. Yet you said nothing when the body was discovered, Miss Marple observed mildly. Bert's shoulders sagged. I was frightened, wasn't I? Harold had sworn me to secrecy about the special arrangement. And when Abel turned up dead? Well, I didn't know what to think. Harold said if anyone asked, I was to claim I knew nothing about special crates or midnight collections. The confession continued with gathering momentum. Harold had supplied the tallow for the wheelbarrow axles, had shown Bert how to retie the broken spiderweb so Abel wouldn't know anyone had been in his yard, and had insisted on personally nailing the false bottom into place with the sort of precision that came from previous experience. He seemed to know exactly what he was doing, Bert admitted. Had all the right tools, knew just how to bend the nails so they'd look proper when hammered back down. Said he'd learned it from his father's carpentry work. Miss Marple nodded with the satisfaction of one whose theories were being confirmed by facts. The spiderweb, with its telltale half-hitch knot, had been Harold's attempt at thoroughness. But like many criminal flourishes, it had served to incriminate rather than exonerate. The web was broken when we moved the wheelbarrow past it, Bert explained. Harold noticed and said we couldn't leave it looking disturbed. Showed me how to tie it back properly. Said it was important that everything looked natural. As Bert's confession wound to its conclusion, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the curious psychology of accomplices. Harold Blee had been clever enough to plan an elaborate murder, but had made the fundamental error of assuming that his co-conspirator would remain silent under pressure. The spiderweb, intended as a mark of criminal thoroughness, had instead become the thread that unraveled the entire scheme. Truth, she mused, had indeed found its way to the surface, as it always did when patient observation was applied to the small details that criminals invariably overlooked in their concentration on grander deceptions. Chapter 9. The Ime. Postmistress's Waits, the revelation of Bert Cole's unwitting complicity had cast the entire affair in a new and darker light. Miss Marple spent the remainder of that morning in quiet contemplation, piecing together the sequence of events that had led to Abel Toms's death. By afternoon, she had reached certain conclusions that required verification, and she made her way once more to the post office. Mrs. Pike was behind her counter as always, but there was a tension about her posture that suggested she had already heard whispers of the morning's dramatic confession. The village grapevine, Miss Marple knew, was more efficient than any telegraph system, and news of Bert Cole's breakdown had undoubtedly reached every household by tea time. Mrs. Pike, Miss Marple began with her customary gentleness, I wonder if I might trouble you to look at your weight records once more? There may be additional details that could prove significant. Nora Pike produced her ledger with the same mechanical precision she applied to all her duties, but Miss Marple detected a slight tremor in her hands. What particular details interest you, Miss Marple? The timing, primarily. You recorded the chest weight at 4:40 in the afternoon, but I'm curious about the circumstances surrounding that weighing. Mrs. Pike turned to the relevant page, her finger tracing the neat entries with practiced ease. Yes. Here it is. Chest to blue bore, 86 lb, heavy. I noted it as heavy because it exceeded the usual weight for such shipments by a full 10 pounds. And Mr. Blee was present during this weighing? Oh, yes. Most insistent about it, actually. Said he wanted to ensure his business arrangements were being handled with proper care. watched me place it on the scales twice, as though he didn't trust my equipment. Miss Marple leaned forward with interest. Did he seem surprised by the weight? Mrs. Pike considered this carefully, her methodical mind reviewing the scene. Now that you ask, no, he didn't seem surprised at all. If anything, he seemed satisfied, as though the weight confirmed something he had expected. Most illuminating, Miss Marple murmured. Tell me, did he handle any of your equipment during this process? He did, rather presumptuously, I thought. Picked up several of my spare waybills while I was weighing the chest. Claimed he was interested in the forms used for commercial shipping. Said he might need similar documentation for his own business expansion. Mrs. Pike opened a drawer beneath her counter and withdrew a small stack of blank shipping forms. I keep extras on hand for customers who require them. Mr. Blee examined several quite thoroughly. Miss Marple studied the forms with the careful attention of a scholar examining ancient manuscripts. One of them bore a distinctive crescent-shaped smudge near the top corner, precisely the sort of mark that might be left by a thumb bearing traces of some oily substance. This particular form appears to have been handled, she observed, lifting it delicately toward the window. There's quite a distinctive scent about it. Mrs. Pike leaned closer and inhaled slightly. Bergamot, she said with certainty. Unmistakably bergamot oil. How very curious, Miss Marple replied. And you're quite certain this form was among those he examined? Absolutely. He spent considerable time looking them over. Said he wanted to understand the proper procedures for commercial documentation. Even asked about the penalties for providing false information on shipping forms. This last detail struck Miss Marple as particularly significant. A man planning to falsify shipping documents would naturally want to understand the legal consequences of detection. Harold Blee's seemingly casual inquiry was beginning to look like criminal research. Mrs. Pike, you mentioned that if the chest had been sent by post, it would have required additional postage. How much additional? £10 over the standard rate would have cost an additional 2 shillings and 6pence. Quite substantial when you consider the usual postage for such items. Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. And your scales, are they regularly calibrated? Monthly by the postal inspector? They must be absolutely precise for official business. I take considerable pride in their accuracy. There was a note of professional dignity in Mrs. Pike's voice that brooked no question about her competence. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Inspector Slack, who entered the post office with the grim expression of a man whose case was finally beginning to make sense. He had spent the morning taking Bert Cole's formal statement, and the weight of evidence was now pressing heavily upon Harold Blee's rapidly crumbling alibi. Mrs. Pike, he began without preamble, I need to ask you about yesterday afternoon, specifically about Harold Blee's behavior when you weighed that chest. I've been discussing exactly that with Miss Marple, Mrs. Pike replied. Mr. Blee seemed remarkably interested in the weighing process, and he handled several of my forms while observing. Inspector Slack examined the bergamot-scented waybill with obvious satisfaction. Fingerprints, he muttered. We'll want to check this for fingerprints. Miss Marple cleared her throat delicately. Inspector, there's something else that may prove relevant. The timing of the weighing suggests that Harold knew the chest would be overweight before it was even placed on the scales. How so? Consider the sequence of events. According to Bert Cole's statement, he collected the prepared chest from Harold just after midnight Tuesday. The chest was delivered to the Blue Boar as part of Wednesday morning's regular shipment. Yet Harold appeared at the post office Wednesday afternoon, specifically requesting that the chest be weighed. Inspector Slack's eyes sharpened with understanding. He wanted the overweight recorded officially. Precisely. But why would he want evidence of the chest's unusual weight? Unless, Miss Marple paused thoughtfully, unless he intended to use that evidence to support some alternative explanation for the contents. Mrs. Pike looked puzzled. What sort of alternative explanation? I suspect Mr. Blee was preparing to claim that the overweight chest indicated tampering by outside parties, perhaps the London suppliers or transport company. The extra weight would prove that someone had added unauthorized contents to the shipment, deflecting suspicion away from local involvement. Inspector Slack nodded grimly. Clever in a twisted way. Used the evidence of the crime to create an alibi for the crime. But it required Mrs. Pike's precise weighing and documentation to make the scheme work. Miss Marple continued. Harold needed an official record of the chest's unusual weight, created by an unimpeachable source who had no apparent connection to the crime. Mrs. Pike straightened with indignation. You mean he was using my professional reputation to support his deception? I'm afraid so. Your well-known precision with weights and measures made you the perfect unwitting witness to his manufactured evidence. As they prepared to leave the post office, Inspector Slack's expression had settled into one of grim determination. I think it's time we had another conversation with Mr. Blee. Armed with this evidence, I doubt his explanations will prove as satisfactory as they have. Bin! Mrs. Pike watched them go, with the expression of a woman who had discovered that her professional integrity had been exploited by a murderer. Think, she murmured, that my own scales were made part of such a dreadful scheme. Miss Marple paused at the door. Take comfort, Mrs. Pike. Your precision and honesty have helped expose the truth rather than conceal it. Harold Blee's plan depended on your accuracy, but that same accuracy has provided the evidence needed to bring him to justice. The postmistress's weights intended to serve deception had instead weighed truth in the balance and found murder wanting. Justice, Miss Marple reflected, often worked through the very instruments that criminals sought to exploit for their own purposes. Chapter 10. At the Goods Yard. Labels and latches. The cobbles of the Much Benham goods yard rang hollow under their footsteps as Miss Marple, Inspector Slack, and Lady Bantry gathered in the pale afternoon light. It seemed fitting, somehow, that the final revelation should take place here, where the elaborate deception had begun with Harold Blee's tampering of the fatal tea-chest. Harold himself stood between two constables, his former bluster entirely deflated. The confident shopkeeper who had dominated village commerce for so many years had been replaced by a hollow-eyed man whose carefully constructed world was crumbling around him. Beside him, Bert Cole shifted nervously, his weathered face bearing the weight of his unwitting participation in murder. Ladies and gentlemen, Miss Marple began with her characteristic gentleness, we have before us a crime of considerable complexity, one that required both careful planning and intimate knowledge of village routines. But like all murders, it was built upon fundamental deceptions that could not withstand careful examination. Inspector Slack opened his notebook, though by now he suspected he would have little need to record revelations that had already been thoroughly established through evidence. The key to understanding this crime, Miss Marple continued, lies in recognizing that we are dealing not with one deception, but two carefully orchestrated illusions, both designed to conceal the true time and manner of Abel Toms's death. She moved slowly around the yard as she spoke, her eyes taking in the various commercial implements that had played their parts in the tragedy. The first deception was the locked room mystery at Abel's herb shed. Someone wanted us to believe that Abel had been working normally that morning, brewing his customary tea blends. But everything about that scene was false. Harold Blee's face had grown ashen, but he remained silent as Miss Marple methodically dismantled his elaborate construction of lies. Abel never brewed tea that morning. The bergamot scent that filled his shed was applied artificially, rubbed onto the kettle spout and stove chimney to create the impression of Earl Grey production. But Abel despised scented teas and would never have worked with bergamot oil. She paused beside a stack of empty tea chests. their innocent appearance belying the dark purpose to which their counterpart had been put. The kettle contained rainwater, rather than the hard well water Abel always used. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to create the proper scale deposits, drawing soft water from his rain butt and rinsing the kettle to suggest recent use. Lady Bantry, who had remained quietly attentive throughout the explanation, nodded with understanding, and the locked room effect accomplished with remarkable ingenuity. A small block of ice, pressed with salt to accelerate melting, was wedged against the drop latch to hold it in the raised position. As the ice thawed, the latch fell naturally into place, creating the appearance of a room secured from within. The meltwater flowed outward, carrying the salt crystals with it, and leaving that curious star-shaped puddle we discovered. Inspector Slack grunted with grudging admiration. Clever enough. But what about the body? Ah, that brings us to the second deception, the journey in the chest. Abel was murdered elsewhere, then concealed in a tea-chest that had been carefully modified with a false bottom. The chest itself tells us much about the planning involved. Miss Marple indicated the various implements scattered. About the goods yard, the false bottom was expertly constructed, with tinfoil lining and wax-rubbed edges to allow smooth operation. This was not hasty improvisation. It was the work of someone with considerable skill in carpentry and concealment. She moved to examine a collection of shipping labels and cordage. The chest bore Harold Blee's own stenciling beneath its false waybill. Soaps and candles, Blee and Son. The adhesive was still damp when we examined it, indicating very recent application. And the handwriting on the full waybill matched Harold's distinctive style, particularly his characteristic fishhook R. Harold's hands had begun to tremble visibly, but still he said nothing. The binding materials told their own story. Miss Marple continued. Blue trace jute twine from Henshaw's Rope Works. Expensive, specialized cordage that Harold had acquired under false pretenses, claiming commercial interest. Yet Bert Cole assured us that Benham Transport never uses such materials for their standard shipments. She turned to face Harold directly, her pale blue eyes holding his with gentle but inexorable force. But perhaps the most revealing evidence was Mrs. Pike's weight records. You knew the chest would be 10 pounds overweight, the approximate weight of a human torso, and you specifically requested that she document this discrepancy. Why would he want that recorded? Lady Bantry asked. Because he intended to use it as false evidence of tampering by outside parties. The official record of unusual weight would prove that unknown criminals had added unauthorized contents to the shipment, deflecting suspicion away from local involvement. Miss Marple's voice carried a note of sadness as she continued. You underestimated the precision of village observation. Harold, Mrs. Pike noted not only the weight, but your satisfaction when it was confirmed. You handled her waybills while your fingers still carried traces of bergamot oil. You used blue trace twine that could be traced directly back to your shop. You retied a broken spider web with a half-hitch knot that no spider ever learned. The silence stretched taut before Harold finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I never meant for it to go so far. Abel was supposed to come to terms. By what terms? Inspector Slack demanded. Harold's confession emerged in broken fragments. Abel had discovered adulteration in the country blend, sloe and bramble leaves, even traces of ivy, artificially colored and flavored with bergamot to masquerade as genuine Earl Grey. Abel had threatened to expose the fraud to the Women's Institute and the local Chronicle, which would have meant ruin and criminal prosecution for me. I went to reason with him Tuesday evening, told him we could work something out, that there was no need for public scandal. But he was adamant. Said he wouldn't be party to deceiving innocent people about what they were drinking. The confrontation had escalated beyond Harold's intentions. A blow struck in desperation felled Abel, and in panic, Harold had conceived the elaborate scheme to conceal both the death and his own involvement. "I thought if I made it look like city criminals," he said dully, "no one would suspect village people. I meant to pack him just until morning, give him time to reconsider, but he never came round." Miss Marple's expression remained compassionate even as she delivered the final condemnation. "You enlisted poor Bert's help by claiming Abel had agreed to the midnight collection. You used his lorry, his reputation, and his innocence to transport your victim to what you hoped would appear to be his natural destination." As Harold Blee was led away, his shoulders sagging under the weight of his crimes, Miss Marple reflected on the curious nature of murder. It was so often the small vanities and cutting corners that led to greater deceptions, until a man found himself trapped in a web of lies that could only be maintained through violence. Final scene. Truth in the Leaves later, taking tea with Lady Bantry in the comfortable sitting room of her cottage. Miss Marple stirred thoughtfully and gazed out at the peaceful village green. "Such a pity," she murmured. Harold might have built a successful business through honest effort. Instead, he chose to take shortcuts with other people's trust. And poor Abel paid the price for his integrity. Lady Bantry observed, "Indeed. Though in the end, his dedication to truth served just as well." The very evidence Harold tried to suppress, the bergamot he despised, the hard water he always used, the precision he demanded, all spoke for him when he could no longer speak for himself. Miss Marple set down her teacup with a gentle clink. "People think tea is about smell and labels. But it's really about leaf and water, and the honesty of those who prepare it." Harold relied on deceptive labels and false aromas. But the village, if one listens carefully, always tells the truth about weights and measures. The evening shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead as peace settled once more over the village. Truth, like properly brewed tea, had required patience and careful attention to emerge in its full strength. But once revealed, it had proved strong enough to wash away even the most elaborate deceptions. Thank you for joining me tonight. I hope this tale brought you a moment of calm, clarity, and quiet satisfaction. Until next time, take care and remember, sometimes the smallest details carry the greatest truths.